Welcome to Grow Virtually, an online horticultural educational program presented by the Master Gardener Volunteers of Cobb County. Under the guidance of the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, we grow gardeners.
So tonight's presentation is really about the transformation of a 25-acre plot of land once owned by the Georgia Department of Transportation. And now it's the home to KSU's Field Station. Along with the Food Forest, which is the topic of the program tonight, it is also home to a host of other projects that include orchards, greenhouses that house hydroponics that provide lettuce for the lunchroom, the school, and even a mushroom nursery. So Michael Blackwell is the operations manager at the field station, and Dr. Vanessa Slinger-Friedman, professor of geography, work together to develop the program and the property, and they create and lead research in ways to help solve the problem of food insecurity through sustainable agriculture. So we welcome you tonight.
But I wanted to start off with a little bit of the history of the Food Forest, how it got started. So I had a lot of people come to me at the field station wanting me to get involved in community gardens. Now I'm gonna really surprise you with this statement. I hate managing community gardens with the traditional way that it has always been done, with a bunch of raised beds and annual vegetables and things like that. I've probably helped at least 5 or 6 get started. People came to me from specific communities and said, we want to do a community garden at the church or whatever. Can you help us? And I did. And then I'd drive by 2 years later and it's all weedy and just a mess. And so one of the first times that I met Vanessa, she came to me and showed her interest in the field station and wanted to get some programs going at the field station. We hadn't really decided what, and then one day she came to me and she said, hey, have you ever heard of the Food Forest? And I was like, yes, let's do one. And she was like, oh, I didn't know you would be so excited to do that. Because it's a little bit different take on a community garden. So the overall concept with the Food Forest is that we're replacing at least a portion of annual vegetable beds with perennial species. Some of those being very long-lived. And there's models of defunct food forests out, especially on the West Coast, that people don't actually take care of them anymore, but they're still producing food 50 years later because they have a lot of perennial species, nut trees, fruit trees, and things like that. But if you're going to incorporate some of these things that are going to provide a lot of calories to the community, especially nut trees, I mean, I'm sure most of you know how big a pecan tree gets, So design is a very different process for a food forest than it would be a typical community garden. Now our food forest has annual vegetable plots, it has raised beds, but a lot of thought and design had to go into that to make that work. So when I talk to you guys, I'm actually going to ask a few questions. So primary consideration, you think, for making sure that I have room for some raised beds if I'm going to have big species like nut trees and fruit trees. What is a vegetable garden primarily going to need? Sunlight. So one of the key things for designing a food forest is being aware of where your sun angles are. And that's one of the things that I start off with, and we started off with, was if I'm consulting with somebody, I always say, don't plant anything for a year. You should see the looks I get when I say that. Study your site. Really think about the sun, how it's going to move in all of the seasons. Because if you do have some raised beds and it's getting great sun in the middle of the summer, well, do you want winter squash? Do you want early season vegetables like asparagus? Those sun angles are going to change over an entire year. So you have to really study that site. I will mention that there's a great website called Sun Calculator. Really good. If you go there and you put in your exact location, it'll give you angle of the sun for every day through every hour of every day for 365 days a year. And with a compass and an inclinometer, you can actually tell where the shadows are going to be on a brand new piece of property. But still, don't plant for a year.
What's that website again?
Sun Calculator. I believe the actual website is suncalc.com, or it's .org. It's either .com or .org. What's that?
.org.
It is .org? Yeah. If you have a compass with an inclinometer, you only need one tool. And then you know, with a 50-foot tall pecan tree, exactly where its shadows are going to be in your first year. So I knew I would. So I wanted to tell you about why I wasn't really excited about typical community gardens. I still help, by the way. If somebody comes to me and wants to do a community garden, I still do it, but I warn them that there's always those 4 or 5 beds that don't get taken care of, and then their weed seeds spread to their neighbors, and then it starts an argument. And, but the basic concept here is to provide something that will be multi-generational. So if those first couple of years are productive, which actually most of those community gardens are really well done for the first couple of years anyway. They're usually pretty successful. It's usually in the 5-year on that they start to have some problems. But with this design, you will have productivity that will last multi-generations. So that's one of the reasons I liked it. Do you want to go to the first? Okay, all right.
So I'll talk a little bit about the field station, how it got started, just to give you a background of the area. So you had mentioned about 24 acres, the entire field station. The food forest itself is just 1/3 of an acre, really the 4 squares there, with the possibility of expanding into that 5th square. So we're talking about a fairly contained space, fairly small space that we're growing in. It, as was mentioned as well, it was owned by the Department of Transportation, the Georgia Department of Transportation. It was a cement mixing facility, and you'll see in the things going around, the pictures going around, the picture in 2007, where you really can see, it looked like a parking lot, right? It's just very barren looking. So that was, when this land got into Michael's hands, that's what he was dealing with. And KSU was saying, we want production for the Commons, which is the major eating facility with about 5,000 students coming through in a single day. So probably more now, actually, because we've expanded quite a bit. So you'll see as it goes around, really very barren, the land pretty much stripped of its nutrients, and so Michael had to bring it back, and you'll see in the second picture that in, I think that's 2018, 2019, that it looks completely different now. And you know, in terms of what had to be done, the leaf matter off of KSU campus, instead of being trucked to the landfill, which we had to pay for, it now, because of Michael, comes out to the field station, and it gets composted along with other things like coffee grounds, horse manure that people donate to us, etc., and it gets turned into great soil and put back on there. So other things that you did to bring the life.
So you want to hear some? Oh, so these guys will get this. So this was a cement factory, which meant they had trucks with several hundred tons of lime driving through them every day and making concrete. Most of my site that I had to start a vegetable garden on, the pH was 8.5 and 9. So that was my first. Went to the first thing. I was like, oh, this. I could see the lime on the soil.
You can
So
see it
I did those first soil
pictures.
tests. It's like, okay. So you want a vegetable garden the first year, huh? So we put in a hydroponic system.
So these were the conditions we were dealing with on the food forest as well. The other thing we encountered, because it was a cement mixing facility and it was essentially a parking lot, is we were digging to plant, and we encountered asphalt. And so being a university, having students involved in the process, the questions they were asking us, like, well, what does this mean? Do we just throw up our hands and give up? We're like, no, let's go and see. Let's go and do the research and find out what the research says about growing in asphalted areas, and we learned that it actually can form a barrier between a polluted site underground and what you're growing above. The main concern is if you're going to put a very tall canopy tree in, like a pecan, you want to make sure and break that up so that the roots of the pecan can go down. So you don't want your roots going horizontal, as you can imagine. You want it going deeper to give that tree stability. So, so that became a consideration. We'd use ground penetrating radar to see what we were dealing with, and then we broke up the areas that we had to break up in order for the trees to grow over time. So you get an idea of what the background is, what the site is. So we're going to move on now and talk a little bit more about food forests themselves and the characteristics.
By the way, we talk about food forests all the time, but this is the first time we've given this presentation, so I have to kind of look and see where we are in the presentation. So one of the other basic concepts of a food forest is it's a dynamic landscape. I appreciated what he was saying earlier about the fact that he was a ornamental design landscaper. We have to think about all of those things, especially since we're having these multi-generational things, is that they are a dynamic thing that will change over time. So when I planted that pecan tree, it was only 4 feet tall. So what side of the garden do you think I put it on, like as far as like north, south, east, or west?
North.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so those are the kind of things that we had to think of. Now, food forests, we are trying to cover every square inch of this garden. I have one favorite saying that people who are around me a lot go, he's going to say it again. That's nature hates a void. And I love that saying because it's everything when it comes to gardening. I don't care if you are just an annual vegetable gardener. If you put your lettuce 24 inches apart from each other, well, you're going to have weeds. Because nature hates a void. If you don't plant something, nature will. The biggest concept with a food forest is that we're going to cover every square inch of soil that I can, either with a plant that I can eat, or some of the other design considerations that we have are useful plants. We actually planted clumping bamboo in our design. For trellising, we have willows that we use. Oh man, willow is the most useful plant probably in the garden, and you can't eat it because we make all kinds of things. It's trellising stuff material. It's a natural rooting hormone. One of the other things that we do is we propagate from this for new gardens. By the way, we'll take any donations of plants, by the way. If you've got plants you want to share, come see me. But you'll see we have multiple layers. We have our tall tree canopy layer. We have a lower, smaller trees. So for example, at pecan, we also have apples and pears, and then all the way down to some of the smaller trees like figs that you can control the size of. We have a shrub layer, a vining layer. And by the way, I'm going to reference this, all these are layers, different things that we're going to put in to cover all of the ground. And then we have our shrubs, our herbaceous, and root layers. So we go every square inch. Now all this is going to change each season as these things start to grow and start to shade each other out. By covering all the area too, we are conserving water. I wish we actually had time to go through everything because we started our design with how the water moved actually through our landscape. It used to be, the reason it was flooding all the time is because we learned that the DOT had just covered up our parking lot with about 12 inches of soil. If we had done that, they'd have locked us up. But when we brought in the ground penetrating radar, when we were trying to put the tree in, we were hoping like the guy would go over there and say, all right, it stops here. But he just kept going. He's like, well, pretty much the food forest is paved 12 inches below the soil. So, as she said, we took care of that in some specific areas, but then we stopped. Probably can go to the next slide. So I talked about some of the layers. Because it is a dynamic landscape, I never want to forget my furry critters either. That's a sort of a permaculture, I come from a permaculture background. We actually have extra of everything And so we will also plant things with specifically keeping in mind that if we just actually planted these this year, some small some bush cherry trees, or bush cherries that we put in. We'll have other things that are on a higher canopy that they would like, so they don't steal all of our cherries. You know, we try to think of all of those things. But we are providing for animal habitat. The biodiversity helps a lot with pest control, because we are organic. We do everything organically, so we will have specific plants that we plant that will attract most of our pests, not all of them. Aphids like everything, and they're on everything. But we also have medicinal layers, so we address that as well. Plants that we may not necessarily eat, but they have a medicinal purpose for being in the garden. We're going to be making soil, because we didn't have any. Our humus content didn't even read. We had like .something% humus. We had no topsoil at all because it was a construction site. The other thing that makes this really important for us, and one part of the reason we're here, is the community. So teaching these kinds of concepts to other people, and then a lot of people love to just come to a garden just to clear their mind for the day. So I could talk on that one slide for the whole presentation, but I won't. So that's yours, isn't it?
No, it's yours.
Oh, this is mine too?
But I do want to add one thing in terms of planting. The concept of planting in guilds is very important, that you kind of have a focal point, but then you're planting plants that work in concert with each other. That if you need something that you have something that needs shade, you're going to provide that for that plant, or something that needs a nitrogen fixing plant to be associated with it. So planting in guilds is very important. And then also the fact that it's, when you say food forest, for the first couple of years, this system is only 3.5 years old. And for the first couple of years, it was almost embarrassing to have people come visit us, because they were like, well, where's the forest? You know, they really, the concept is, they wanted to see a forest. We're only just beginning to look, like when people come, they're like, we see food forest. So it's getting more and more exciting. But it's, the whole concept is kind of an edge, the edge of a forest. So as the transitioning into the forest, what you're going to find with nature is kind of you're going to see those layers moving into the forest, right? And so everything from your under the soil, your ribosomes, your tuberous crops, and then your, as Michael said, your shrubs, your ground cover, your shrubs, your subcanopies. You want to take advantage of the space. Every bit of space in the system should be used. So your vining layer takes advantage of that vertical space going up, with things like we have Concord and Muscadine grapes for our vining layer. So, and then going up to your tall canopy trees. So every little bit, it's a very efficient system, and every little, you want to take advantage of every little bit of angle of sunlight or shade that a plant might need, and access to nutrients and resources. So.
Yeah, actually guilds are incredibly important. If you are taking notes, planting guild, I don't know if you've ever heard that concept. I don't think I had that in Master Gardeners, but for example, what is a guild? These are plants that either have some sort of beneficial relationship with each other, or they just tolerate each other. For example, I have a guild that's black walnut. Now, you guys probably know black walnut poisons everything around it, except American beautyberry tolerates it. Pawpaw actually does very well underneath black walnut. Daylilies do fine under black walnut, and a number of other things too. So if you have a very small garden and you do want some larger species, there's some really good sites, especially one, it's called Tennessee permaculture or something to that effect. If you put in that and then also put in guild, it has really, really well designed guilds that you can plant every layer, starting with a canopy all the way down to your herbaceous layer and ground covers.
How do you spell that?
Guild, G-U-I-L-D. So planting guild?
Subtitle.
Yeah. It's a really important concept. The other thing too that a lot of people forget in a dynamic landscape is all of the energy. When I say energy, I'm talking about both plants animals and everything is the edges. The edges of anything is the most dynamic part. I love to take students out through the entire field station, and I say, okay, today's the zombie apocalypse. Everything is, and we're all in trouble. Where are you going to find food? And they want to walk into the forest. Like, no, no, no. It starts where the field meets the forest. That's where everything's at. And so in a food forest, we try to make as many edges as possible. Our landscape doesn't look anything like probably any community garden you've ever seen because it's doing this. It's just waves of plants going in and out and in and out. But every square inch of those edges is where everything's happening. That's where all those ground covers meet the shrub meets the small tree, and the small tree meets the big tree, and then vines are growing up all around it, all of it. But you also have to time these things because you guys are familiar with the Three Sisters garden? Okay. Do you plant your beans and your corn the same day? No. So the same thing is that. So for example, our pecan tree, it's still like another year before we actually start putting vining plants around it because it's only about 12 feet tall. So if I planted muscadine, it's going to overwhelm it, and muscadine is the other name for muscadine is kudzu. So you have to time these things out over time. It's a dynamic landscape. So.
And let me just go with the one point, because Michael's pretty much touched on all these points here, maybe emphasize a little bit more about the community part of a food forest, especially if you're growing it to address food insecurity, right? If you're looking at a food desert community and wanting to make a contribution to that community, you have to consider, if I put everything I like, but I'm not part of that community, that food isn't going to be eaten, it isn't going to be taken. So you really have to be considerate about what you put in there. You obviously have to grow things that are right for that biome and that all the resources you have there, where you are in the country, in the location, but you also have to consider what are people's dietary preferences, what's their cultural preference for a fruit or a nut. So that has to be part of your planning in doing that.
Yeah, specifically to that point, I'm glad you're really backing me up here. Because this is so complex. It's not complicated, but it's very complex. So we even have a mushroom layer at the KSU Food Forest. But there are cultures. I actually was working with a guy who teaches people how to do mushrooms, and he had this really cool system. And we actually have a cool system at KSU that we've been working on. We grow essentially mushrooms indoors in a movable container so that it can be like literally, once it's finished and it's ready to go, we can pick that thing up with a helicopter and take it anywhere and drop it. Well, he was working in Haiti on some disaster relief, and so he thought, well, man, they can grow thousands of pounds of mushrooms in no time, and he got there and nobody ate mushrooms. Well, that's not going to work. To your point, if the community doesn't want it, it's not going to work.
So what about major
believe it or not, there's people
considerations?
who don't like broccoli.
What about major considerations, as Michael mentioned, was that the flow of water was critical for us. And we made the decision to have a food forest, and then that spring, this was spring of 2020, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember the rain that we had? It did not stop. And the land got flooded, and so we just sat there going, okay, what do we do? You know, we've got the land here, this is where we've chosen, this is where we got permission to do this. What do we do? And that's where bioswales came into play. So I'm curious, what are your experiences with bioswales? Anybody incorporate them into landscape at all? Okay, the idea is that
referencing.
Or maybe there's another name that they
No, it's just not everybody's familiar with that term.
Right.
So we had a major erosion issues as well. So we had flooding, but the way it's just how the DOT left that property, they had a road going right down the middle of 23 acres, and then it tapered both ways. And since it was so compacted, water just went whoosh, and it was gone. Well, one of the first things that we noticed about the food forest plot that we had picked was that it was flooding. We addressed the flooding first, but we still had a lot of water moving through the landscape and leaving. And so as part of me, you, and a couple of other people in our civil engineering departments, we also wanted to clean that water before it left the site. But what we wanted to do is once we resolved the issue of the flooding, we still wanted the water to move serpentine through the landscape so that we could get away from manually watering too. So we put in a series of what's called dry water beds and catchment basins that serpentine throughout the entire landscape. So that water slowed down. The slowed down areas, we put reeds and plants that would cleanse the water and cause the sediment to settle, to slow it down. Anytime you can slow water, you know, it'll settle out some of the sediment. But once it reached there, we had an overflow that reached another little swale, bioswale, which is swale is a ditch on contour. It's level.
You can kind of see the two of
Yeah.
them, one there and then one there.
And we have some, in the pictures that are passing around, you might be able to see an aerial where you can see the water going through. So once that first catchment fills up, it's full of all kinds of different plants and reeds, and some of those are edible as well. It's part of our design. That sediment will leach out. And then it has an overflow, and then it serpentines through several other beds and reaches another catchment. So if there's any sediment at that point, it'll settle out there. And then it meanders through a couple of more areas before it ever leaves the site. Now the water that comes out on the backside of the food forest is clean. All the sediment's gone, even during a heavy rainfall. First one's always a little muddy, second one's a little less muddy. By the time it reaches the third catchment, it's clean.
You've got to dig these out every summer.
Well, so one of the interesting things about a bioswale is it's intentionally meant to eventually fill up. By the time it fills up, we got all of our canopy and all of our shrub layers in. It will still meander through those paths, probably forever, because it's a different soil structure. But they are meant to eventually fill in. They're not a permanent structure. So eventually the plants themselves that are in the landscape, one of the interesting concepts about a swale, not necessarily a bioswale, is they're actually tree planting devices. So especially for dry landscapes, you dig them just enough to where the first several years they fill up with water, and then they let that water leach into the soil, and you plant trees around it so that you can start to cover that landscape, shade it, cool it. Anytime you do that, you get plants in a place where it used to be barren, you're increasing the soil's ability to hold water. So the concept is actually to let them fill in naturally, so you don't clean them out, which is a weird thing to think about. Which also means that those reeds will eventually probably become something else. This landscape is dynamic. It's going to change forever, except for those pecan trees. We also have American chestnuts.
And the bioswales also invite other wildlife in as well. It provides homes, it provides water for other wildlife as well.
Dogs. My dog loves to bathe.
Right. Taters often in it.
Yeah.
So this just gives you, this is 2020, gives you an idea of what the landscape look like.
Can't quite see the pavement 12 inches underneath the
Right.
ground.
And then the other picture, the first group of students that we worked with, federal work study students. So that's another aspect of the project, is working with students. It's an educational institution. It's a research project. It's a way students get employment and they had hands-on experience working in this system. They learn about agriculture, learn about some pretty hard work. It's a lot of hard work. So it's.
We also had Bermuda grass.
Oh yeah. Oh, had?
We still have Bermuda grass. Yeah.
So we talked about layering and gills. Just some examples at goji berries. We try to use not a big project, not a big funded project. Actually, we pretty much scrape by with what we get. If I do a workshop and I get a little bit of funds from that, we buy some plants there, or we do some exchanges if we can't get plants. So it's really been, it's not like someone's handed us a check and said, you know, here's all the funds to go. We've done it bit by bit as I can get money and as we get opportunities to get plants. And an example of the money saving, or the way to get things that you can help build your system and educate people in your system. It's just, the students come up with these ideas like, oh, we have a rock, well, let's paint it, and we've got a QR code, and we'll just be creative, and we'll paint on there, and people can come by with their phone and go over the QR code and get a whole bunch of information. So it's just a neat, relatively free way to have a self-guided tour there, because students come up with these creative ideas. So that's the great thing about working with volunteers and also with students in the project. So we've also had the benefit of student groups like the Geography Student Club or EcoWows, which is a very active sustainability student group. They wanted to do a pollinator planting, or they want to do pollinator counting, or they want, they're always, now we've become quite known where they're reaching out to us and wanting to do projects and events with us. So it's a great way to engage your community. It becomes a great living, learning lab for the community of students and faculty and staff. Tomorrow we're having a Friday in the Food Forest, which is an event that we do for the community. Anybody can come. Largely we have students showing up, but also some faculty and staff, and also Cobb County community members can come out. We have one every September, October, November, so you're welcome to come out to those as well. Okay, so production, I think this is me. All right, so we're in year 3.5. If you know anything about perennials, you know the ones that we're already seeing, right? Can you imagine what we might be getting some production on? It's low, but we're getting what would be showing up pretty quickly, I think. Some grapes, right?
Muscadines.
Blueberries.
Blueberries. Unfortunately, we've had some issues with our blueberries, so the
pH 8.5,
issue.
pH is
Yeah.
Our blueberries are yellow,
Yeah.
but they're getting there.
Yeah. So we have a little more work to do on that, but we are getting blackberries and strawberries. You can imagine, tons of strawberries. Our raised beds have given us tremendous production with squash, zucchini, beans, corn.
One thing just before I forget, because I'm going to have to shut up or I'll never let you get through your part. We are trying to also stay away from named varieties or anything that's patented, because we also are using this as a nursery bed to give out plants to the community. And so that's part of the reason, like, we have hazelnuts, we have currants, we have all these shrub plants, but we went with non-patented varieties so that we could then hand them out. So we don't need to ever get in any trouble.
Also some goji berries, turmeric. That's the other thing that we've been able to harvest as well, and keeps coming back wonderfully. It's some great plants.
Yeah,
that
if
we
you have one
there.
of turmeric that will grow in Georgia, we got it.
Yeah, very nice. So you get an idea of that we're getting some production, but it's very, very low if you're comparing it at this point. But at some point it is going to be quite significant. The production that we have right now, we are giving it out to the community. The idea is to address communities that are not getting access to fresh fruit, nuts. So you may be familiar with some of these bus ministries. Free 99 Fridge, they used to be all over Metro Atlanta. Sadly, they're now just at one Presbyterian church. But it's basically a fridge that is totally available, no questions asked for the community. We can put our fresh fruit in there, and community members can come take it. Also on campus, you may be familiar with KSU Cares, which is a free pantry for KSU students who are in need. So they have clients who are, just their kids living out of their cars. In some cases, they're in college, but they're homeless. I mean, that's a reality. It's a small portion, but it's still an issue. You also have kids who go up through the foster system that they age out, and then sometimes they run into issues with just maintaining themselves for life away from no longer having that home. So KSU Care is another place that we have given our produce to. So it is obviously a system that is going to be producing food in good quantities, right? Pecans are going to be, you know, probably starting up year 7, we'd say, maybe really hitting more year 14, like bigger
It's a
production.
grafted pecan, so it's faster than most, but it's still
It'll take a
probably
while.
6-7 years.
Right, but you know, we do anticipate that production. But in the meanwhile, this is really a model that we're, and I'll talk about it in just a second. It's a model that we are trying to put into communities that are considered USDA designated food desert designated communities. So they meet that qualification. So we're already working in Pittsburgh, in Southwest Atlanta to do that. But up at Kennesaw, we bring classes out there. I have a local and global sustainability class that comes out there. We have geographies of sustainable agriculture, or geographies of agriculture, and they come out. And just getting students involved, right? Volunteering or working in federal work study positions, you know, just getting their hands in the soil, planting stuff. That's just so important for them to understand where food comes from. That it actually is, it can be quite challenging to grow something sometimes. I mean, you all know this, I know this, that you kill so much before you really get good at and making things survive and produce, right? I grew up.
You're not killing, you're not growing.
Right. I grew up in a tropical place, and so I know tropical agriculture, and here am I learning about temperate agriculture, and I feel like I'm starting from scratch again. I rely so much on Michael to help me figure things out. But it's wonderful, that process of learning, right? And for students, it's the same thing, being in a living learning lab. You're in a classroom in the outdoors. That's my favorite place to be. So we also hire AmeriCorps Vista. So if you probably know Peace Corps, that's people who travel abroad to go work in communities. AmeriCorps is kind of Peace Corps for the United States. So we get summer AmeriCorps Summer Associate Vistas. So they're 40 hours a week, and they come and work with us. We do internships, we do volunteerism, we do events. So we're really trying to use the space as more than just food production. It's got so many purposes. Just like the plants in the system that are multi-purpose, the system itself is multi-purpose for how we use it. Would you want to add anything else there?
There's a couple of things that you mentioned. So again, the biggest dividing concept here between a traditional annual vegetable garden is that with any sort of annual vegetable garden, the second you stop putting seeds in the ground, they stop producing fruit. This never does. So there was one of the things that got us started on this is there was some pretty good anecdotal evidence that if you incorporate this design with a food forest base, and then you include annual vegetable production, which we do, we have a lot of raised beds too, that it provides more calories than an annual vegetable garden, because it's year-round too. For example, when does persimmons ripen? Anybody know? Persimmon? Oh, I'm sorry, the Asian persimmons. So it's going to start real soon, and I picked my last persimmon in December last year, and that was good and soft, the way they're supposed to be. But that's the big fuyus. But also, I'm in the mountains, by the way. It's a little bit different than you guys. But so what this means is that where we get these established, especially in urban areas, and urban areas, by the way, are great places to grow food. You got a heat island. So everybody thinks heat's bad. Well, not for a lot of the fruits that we grow. These people can come into the community even if they haven't, and they're allowed into that community's food forest. There's food year-round. So it's not just, you don't have to rely on those people that are planting those annual vegetables in their raised beds.
So these are some pictures from Southwest Atlanta and Pittsburgh. We've planted 4 food forests there with a program, so it's kind of a sister program to the KSU Food Forest. It's called Good Food Green City. And they're on, I don't know if anybody does Instagram. We have our QR code there if you want to follow us, or also look up Good Food Green City. But they're what's magical about that project is that they're working with 8 high school students from that community, and they are for 6 weekends every fall and spring. They meet with the students. They teach them about everything from raised beds to mushroom growing to food, all the concepts and elements of a food forest, and they're actually doing the stuff. They're not just sitting in a classroom space. It's all hands-on learning, and bringing in people like Michael has done the workshop on mushrooms, creating mushroom logs, etc. So it's really the goal. I mean, you can imagine if they do pay attention and they are interested, they're going to come up with some tremendous skills that they can start a composting business. They can start a mushroom growing business. I mean, these are some really tangible skills that they could be getting to impact their economy, right? To get a job or go to college and take it one step further, right? So it's a great program.
Yeah.
And
the last thing, unless you've got some more to add, was that the other thing about a food forest and for our training purposes and our community outreach is that we go beyond just basic horticulture. We get into grafting of fruit trees, we get into propagation of woody species and shrub plants, and we do that, and there's my dog, isn't he cute? So we have a lot of other skills that we teach rather than just your basic horticulture about fertilization and pest control and things like that. One of the more popular ones is the mushroom gardening and also of grafting of fruit trees. People love that. Most people, especially young people, don't know anything that every Macintosh apple that's ever existed came from one tree. So they don't know that, and it's a really fun thing to teach people how to do. Magical, actually.
so this picture here shows all the different, well, it's maybe a tiny bit outdated, but we thought it's a good overview of what the field station looks like, and also some of the different projects happening at KSU at the field station. It's an active research field station with the mushroom cultivation. We have a forensic field lab there. We have a bird research going on European starlings. Propagation lab, hydroponics. I mean, it's our favorite place to be. So want to pass that around as well, so you get an idea of.
It's for plant people, so I hope to see every face that's here eventually come by. Do try to group together. You know, maybe small groups of. You're welcome to come out, and we'll show you all this stuff. And boy, did I ever breeze over most of it.
So if you did want to coordinate something, please get in touch with us. You have our information there, but yeah, as a group would be great. But if you want to coordinate a hands-on kind of experience and visit, we'd really welcome you.
And lastly, we are reimagining our field station. We're not a land grant agricultural school, that's UGA. But we found our niche with suburban and what we refer to as peri-urban horticulture and gardening and food forests and things like that. So we're expanding our community outreach. So we'd love to maybe work with you guys if you have, for example, I used to do something with the Cherokee Master Gardeners and the extension agent up there. We had a grafting work day where we, Master Gardeners and then people who were paying to support the Master Gardener program would come out and we'd teach them how to graft fruit trees. So I'd be interested in working with you guys, especially since you're so close, to do some, you know, cool projects like that. We also had a tool day where I showed all the really good gardening tools that make gardening more enjoyable and less of a burden. I have a good collection of tools. So those kinds of things.
Flame weeding, that's when I was introduced to flame weeding, and I love it.
Has anybody here flame weeded? It's fun.
I've seen it done.
Yeah.
No, it's exciting. I had to go get one from home after that. I was like, whoo, I gotta get myself that flame weed.
They do that here at the rain garden.
Oh, yeah. I think we did that pretty good as far as for a Q&A.
Yeah.
Now, if you wanted to do
You're
that
welcome
real quick.
to, and then we gotta get a little, we have to prove that we do work and we were here. So would you mind if Michael come on in and take everybody just
I don't do
smile? Come, we must. Wait, hold on. I have to get you find people in there. Hold on, let me just make sure it's good.
My first selfie.
We need some proof. Yes, we've got, okay. Thank you so much.
Before the Q&A though, I will say we are still in our research phase. So there may be some really good questions that I don't mind at all saying, I have no idea. So, yes.
second
What
that.
types of apple trees are you growing? I have urban apples that are fun to grow.
Well, that's depends on if you're asking me or if you're asking KSU. We have about 12 varieties at KSU. At one point I had 200. I'm
So
a
you
bit
know
of
a
an
lot
apple
about
nut.
apples, so I'm gonna call
But
you-
all of mine now are I'm getting rid of mine. They're all in the University of Georgia's program. I was a big collector of rare apple trees. I worked a lot with Mr. Lawson in Dawsonville, if you've ever heard of that legend. I worked with him a lot 20 years ago and collected a lot of the varieties that I was afraid was going to disappear. We probably will do something like that. Most of the varieties that we have at KSU are your standards, your Fuji's, Golden Delicious, Arkansas Black, those kinds. I'll probably move some of that nursery that I have in my collection over to KSU at some point, but those were a donation from Home Depot, is how we acquired those. Yes,
I know you're only, what you say, 3.5 years into this.
yes.
Okay. So we have trees and we've tried to grow fruit and we have the fattest squirrels in Cobb County.
Mm.
So what, looking in future years, when you start developing a bigger canopy with your larger trees,
Mhm.
how are you going to keep that in balance with the wildlife? And I wanted to ask you about deer also.
Well, we've had deer there,
Yeah.
we have.
I didn't have a problem until we had fruit trees with deer. They weren't too bad with the vegetable gardens, too bad. But once you put in apple trees, every deer in the state of Georgia goes, "Have you seen their apple trees? They're tasty." So I've got a controversial answer to that, and it's plant extra. And I say that jokingly, but it really is. So unless you're willing to shoot a deer or shoot a squirrel, natural control methods are very limited. All of the things, especially for squirrels, they usually figure out over time.
Yeah, they do. We've tried
And
everything.
it's sad. So I was serious when I said that, things like cherries, robins and cardinals, if you have cherries, they get most of them. So we have different layers of bright red shiny things they'll take usually the upper canopy and they stay away from. That's one of the reasons I moved to a shrub cherry. By the way, look that one up, Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan's bush cherries. Oh, they're fabulous. She just bought one that was this tall and it was $60.
It was
They're expensive.
Yeah.
But I have some of those in my house, and they outproduce every Montmorency tree that I have off of a shrub that I can actually stand and pick. I don't like ladders anymore. I'm getting a little too old for ladders. So those are the kinds of things when I say we're doing research, we're trialing things like the bush cherries versus a traditional cherry tree.
Because you've got 25 acres.
The food
Well,
forest
the
is
food forest
only
is only 1/3. And,
1/3
yeah,
of an
not
It's only
growing.
1/3 of an acre.
Yes.
Then I'll take back what I said. I'll see you in 10 years and see how the squirrels are doing.
Right.
Oh, they're going to be fat and happy. I can
Oh,
tell
yeah.
you that.
But that is one of the principles of a permaculture system, is that you're working with nature. You do give a percentage of your produce to nature.
Yeah,
to
without
the
me
wild.
trying to be funny,
Yeah.
which I wasn't really. I was serious that we do plant extra. But some of the research we are doing is to try to find if that bush cherry is a really important part of your design that you want, we're experimenting with other species of things that maybe we can distract them a little bit from that.
Or repel them, repellers.
So, for example, great answer to your question was I tried the bird netting over my bush cherry, and within 2 weeks I had caught 2 king snakes that got caught in there and got all tangled up. Well, I want my king snakes, but they had crawled up in there and they got all tangled, and I was sitting there trying to cut them out, and they were already cut. It was horrifying. So even some of the logical controls that you may try, they don't always work either. It's sad. Yes.
On this picture, there's a building microplastics remediation.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing that with mushrooms or? something else or something?
No, that's a soil column study that one of our soil professors works with. They're trying to play around with mulches and things like that to try to layer it out. It's a kind of a complicated system, but we do also have researchers that are working on mushroom research because they eat, there's a couple of species that eat plastics. So we haven't delved too deeply into that one yet. Yes?
On your compost, you were saying you were mixing in horse manure. Have you had any problem with grazing?
Oh yes, we don't use it in our greenhouses with tomatoes for sure. Most of our compost that we have that comes from horse manure goes on forest trees, or not forest trees, but like the apple trees and things like that. It doesn't go in our annual vegetable gardens because yeah, Grazon, 2,4-D, it's evil. We have had a few instances where I went on vacation or something and I come back and we have an 80-foot row of tomatoes, and like the last 4 are all like this. Where'd you guys get that compost? Because we work with students and they grab the wrong pile sometimes, but that's a huge issue. But we also, some of the things I've breezed over, we try to collect all of the stuff that we can get for free. So I get that for free. So I'm going to use it somewhere.
What is it?
What's that?
Grazon, what is it?
Grazon, are you familiar with 2,4-D?
Yeah.
It's a
weed.
broadleaf
Yeah.
herb killer. So it persists in the soil for, who's the Cherokee extension agent? Paul Puglisi?
Yeah.
He's like an expert. That's one of the main things he studies is 2,4-D. At one point, I don't know if this information's changed, he said it can persist in your compost if you use horse manure or anything that's been sprayed with 2,4-D for up to 6 years. And the only way to get it out is to grow grasses in that compost, harvest the grasses, get them out, and do that for several seasons, and it will pull the 2,4-D out. So all the things that we used to use, manure, I mean, that was critical for organic gardening. A lot of them I have to stay away from.
We hope that you will find our information informative and helpful. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.